Hey, everybody. Welcome to What Fresh Hell Laughing in the Face of Motherhood. This is Amy.
And this is Margaret. And today we're talking about when kids ask tough questions.
Every day. I mean,
Yeah.
sometimes they're
And
really tough.
certainly ages and stages. And as I now move into my youngest is 12. And so really kind of I've seen this at all ages and stages. We definitely have, a little bit of thoughts from the outside, but I think it's something that we all deal with. I will make a disclaimer before we begin that we are, because of the nature of this conversation, going to be talking about some things that may be upsetting for kids to hear, and also some things that peek behind some of the magic of some traditions and holidays.
Okay.
And so this might be a good one to use earphones with or not listen to with, little ones
They call
around.
that co-listening in the podcast biz. When
Hmm.
you're listening with your kids around, like you
Yes.
co-listening. Yeah. So no co-listening
I
perhaps for
wouldn't
this one.
co-listen to this one with little ones around because there's gonna be some stuff that we discuss.
Can we
Um,
can we define the different kinds of things that might make a question tough?
yes, let's do that.
I mean,
Let's turn to
I'm
Corey
ramping here.
Turner
Okay.
and Anya Kamenetz, from NPR, and they give some examples
Oh,
of
okay.
some questions that might be hard to answer. I know she died, but when is grandma coming back?
Okay.
Why is your skin darker than mommy's? Why do we live here but daddy doesn't? Are you the tooth fairy?
So, okay. So it seems to me that there's tough questions that we don't want to answer. That's one kind of a tough question.
Yes.
Like,
Tough
you
questions we
can,
don't want to answer.
and tough questions we can't answer, ones we don't want to answer, and
And
ones
then,
that they can't handle the answer, maybe? Is that
yep.
a
And
third
very
category?
importantly, ones we don't know the answer to.
Uh-huh.
I think that's a hard one. And also ones that feel sticky in some maybe more amorphous way. These might be questions around race, religion, you know, the idea of having a conversation about something that you're not sure your own takes on or views on and trying to walk your kids through that. Something as simple as passing a homeless person on the street. And
Mhm.
and why doesn't that person have a home? It's a very complicated question, right?
Right.
And especially a young child is used to looking to you for why things are the way they are in the world. And the question of why any given person is sleeping outside on a city street, let's say, is way beyond a conversation that we can probably have with a 3-year-old. And
Right.
so it's like a mismatch sometimes of what the question is and how complicated the answer is. Like, are we talking about systemic issues? Are we talking about this individual's experience of life that we don't know anything about? Like, these questions get very huge and they seem very difficult to explain to little people.
I like what you said, that there's a difference between questions that can't be answered, like, "Why does God allow bad things to happen?" or something like
Right?
that,
I
right?
got nothing.
And
Yep.
a question that maybe can be answered by not by you right now, like, "Does daddy love his new girlfriend more than us?" Like something like that, that like, "Oh, there's an
Right.
answer that exists, and not only are you not sure you can handle it, I'm not sure I know or can handle the answer yet." That's a whole other part of I don't know, something you don't know, but the answer is out there.
Yeah. And then the big issues like why would someone shoot kindergartners at their school? You don't know the answers, you don't have the answers, and you're also very upset by the question.
Mhm.
Or like, my mom has passed away when she was sick, you know, you're dealing with your own emotionality around it. And then when your kids are like, well, is she going to die? You're like, hold on. Like, I
Right.
haven't even processed that for myself. And I'm
Right.
certainly not ready to have a conversation with you about it. And kids are also truth tellers in a certain way. Like they kind of can cut through some of the stuff that we're not doing. So I may have had lots of conversations with the grown-ups in my life of, okay, this is the diagnosis and this is what's going on and these are the options and these are the treatments and da, 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 da. And when a 3-year-old kind of breaks through that all and says, "Is she going to die?"
Mhm.
It can really kind of get you on an emotional level that you're not ready for.
Yes, and it's such a good point, like, you can talk about it, but you can't talk about it in a parental, protective, "I'm gonna walk you through this in a way that will make you feel better about it instead of worse," kind of way. That's a whole other kind of tough question, right?
Yep.
Like, we can talk about it, but I'm gonna get upset and mommy upset or daddy upset, any parent upset is not something that a kid necessarily wants to see, even if they asked a provocative question, they didn't necessarily mean it to be provocative, right? It's like the emperor has no clothes. Little kids just say it,
Right.
sometimes without realizing that they're saying the thing that isn't supposed to be said.
Yeah. And I think it can be very jarring when things like that happen. On the flip side, it is very important to answer children's questions because if you, and we've talked about this with Britt Hawthorne around issues of race, we've talked about it with
With
a
Joanne
lot of,
Finkelstein about
yes,
why do we say, Mrs. Robert Finkelstein instead of just Mrs. Amy Finkelstein, and we shut down the questions. That when we shut down kids' questions instead of answering them honestly or thoroughly or satisfactorily, we leave the kid thinking there's something wrong with them for having asked, I guess. Or they make up their own reasons. They make up their
right,
own answers.
that they will find an answer. And so I think it's important when we think about tough questions from kids to realize that they are going to get that information from somewhere once they start asking the question.
Mhm.
And sex is a great example, right? Like, if you are
Right.
not providing the answers, we know that a young Amy Wilson used to
5th grade
sit on
Amy
them.
Wilson. Yep.
She used to sit on what? The fire escape?
It was a fire escape outside the, Methodist church at the corner of the street where I grew up. I mean, it was like Lucy in the Charlie Brown cartoon, like, "The doctor is in, come, you don't even have to
Come
pay
on
me 5
over.
cents. I will tell you the facts of life. I will tell you where babies come from." I was remarkably wrong in the macro and micro in my confident, answers to these questions, but right, 5th graders were coming to me instead of to their parents. Maybe because they were afraid to ask their parents, or maybe when they bring it up, the parents say, "We don't talk about that in this house," or "Go
Mhm.
wash your mouth out with soap," or whatever. They didn't answer the questions.
And listen, some of that is going to happen. Like, kids, I got a lot of my information on the school bus about what was going on. And
Sure.
was it good information? No. Was it factual information? Rarely.
Right. Is that how it
Did I
goes? Yeah.
occasionally come home and pass this information along to my horrified parents? Yes, I did.
Mhm.
And that goes with the territory. But if there is information that is important for you to provide, you got to be answering these questions and you have to be, I think, ready for the questions before they come to a certain degree.
Yep.
And I think with there's always gonna be things that you don't know the answer to. My kids experienced a horrifying tragedy in their childhood, and it was I think I've talked about it on the podcast before, but I learned what had happened before my children did, and I was responsible for telling them what had happened. And the fact of the matter is I could not actually get the words out of my mouth. I just couldn't do it. I failed the test. I
Without crying, or with, not to delve into this, but was it that you couldn't do it without getting upset in a way that would seem scary, or you literally couldn't say it? It couldn't come
couldn't
out at
say
all?
it. I
At
wasn't
all.
emotional. I just found it so I hedged my bet a little bit. I kind of explained in loose parameters what had happened. I left information out. My kids that went to school where there were counselors and people talking, but
Okay.
mostly
Yeah.
the kids talking to each other because,
Yep.
the
Fill in the
the
blanks.
words and my kids came home having filled in a lot of the blanks. And I wish I had told them myself. But these are very hard things to do. It is very, very hard. I have friends who had spouses that were extremely ill. And I do not blame people who have trouble saying, like, daddy's not going to make it. He's going to die of this disease. Like,
Mhm.
sometimes you're just not ready to face that yourself until um, I
Yes.
found I didn't have kids when 9/11 happened, but I had a young person in my life, and I remember talking to her that day. She was maybe 9 years old, and just talking about what had happened, and I found it very hard to say out loud, like, "No, there were people in the planes. They were innocent people just trying to go to work that
Mhm.
day or go take a trip. No, people fell from the like, saying the reality of what happened is just phenomenally difficult. It's painful. It's awful. Is that something you struggle at? Like, would you have trouble, or do you feel like you would be able to be like, "This is what happened. I'm a factual reporter," and
I bring 2 pieces of data to this personally, which is I have 2 very close loved ones who lost parents at a young age. And
Mm,
in both cases, this was not a recent occurrence. These are grown-ups, but in both cases, those, people as children did not have their questions answered. Their questions
mhm,
were dismissed. They were not told the truth. The truth was kept from them, and then the parent died anyway.
mm,
And they are struggling with the not having understood and not having had it explained to them decades later.
yeah.
So I bring to this, you can't do that. But that doesn't mean that when this is something you have to do, it makes it easier. I just know that it's definitely worse not to answer the kids' questions.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that as we delve into it, we're gonna find some kind of questions and answers along the way, and I do think that you also don't necessarily like, when my five-year-old, who's now this is 25 years later, 24, 23 years later after 9/11,
Mhm.
um, is saying what happened, I don't have to provide every single aspect of every single answer. Like, there's a balance sometimes between saying, "Grandma is very sick. We're not sure how this is gonna go. There is a possibility that grandma gets better, and there is a possibility that she dies from this disease," that kind of, and answering a 9/11 question with every single detail, every single terrifying detail. Like, there is
Right.
certainly a happy medium between those things, and I think
Yeah.
that this
Yes,
this is where
exactly.
ages and stages
Yes.
becomes very, very
I will
important.
tell, since we've already said this is a, not a co-listening episode, I'll tell this story. I have a much younger brother. I'm almost like an aunt to him. I'm so much older than him. And so he came to me as a tween. This is a long time ago now. He's grown up now himself, asking me what AIDS was.
Mm,
And I answered what AIDS was as a college student
mm,
by explaining to my younger brother about condom use
mm.
and about, um, IV drug use and
Mm.
like
You
a
went deep.
very right.
You
And
were
he
like,
looked at
"Kid,
me
come meet me at the fire
right,
escape."
right. And he looked at me and I said, "Does that answer your question?" And he said, "What's a condom?" And I realized that I had
Oh,
completely
you
overshot the mark. And then I was
jumped.
like, never mind, ask mom, never mind." Yeah.
I mean, you were totally back in fire escape mode. You
I
were like, "Have I
totally
got a
was.
tale for you?"
Yes, and this time at least I was like, I have extremely accurate information. I am a college student with, the most up to date. This is like when I was in college, like AIDS was in the news, so I could give my younger brother extremely correct and overwhelming information that baffled him
He
further.
was not ready for,
No,
as
he
it
was
turned
not
out.
ready. No.
This is a big point that we're gonna be talking about, and I'm going to name it after this break. So, in researching and talking to people about this topic, the number one advice for tough questions is answer the question that is asked.
Mhm. Mhm.
And this is where Amy, we hate to point fingers on the podcast, went a bit astray when asked,
Mhm.
"What
Yes.
is
Yes, I did.
AIDS?"
Learn from my mistake.
What
Right.
is AIDS? AIDS is a disease of the immune system.
Right. Well, Dr. Lisa Damore, we've talked to her about this on the show, and she might even say you start with, "Well, what do you think it is?" Right? "What have
Mm,
you heard?" You put it back on them. Get as much as you can out of like, why are they asking?
right. I
before
think
you and then that's the question you answer.
that's right. So that's right. The key to the tough question lies in the pause that comes after the
Mm,
question is asked.
yes.
So, are you the Easter Bunny? Pause. Is the person asking this question 2, 5, 7, 9, or
Yeah.
12? Right?
Right, right.
Um, how available are they? And what answer do you think they're looking for? So, as Amy says, right? As we say, TTQA, that's a big thing in the schools now with how you
Oh, what's
answer a
this?
question. Turn the question around.
Oh, TTQA, okay.
So if you say, what happened to Europe during the first years of World War II? In the first years of World War II, what happened in Europe was like you turn the question around. And so I think, yes, why are you asking, am I the Easter Bunny?
Right.
Like turning it back to say, because if your child, and also you bring in the information that you know, like, is the child asking because they already know? Is the child asking because they want reassurance that you're not? Are they asking because they're ready to leave parts of this story behind? We don't know.
I was riding in a taxi with my first grader who asked me about the tooth fairy. So imagine, like, I'm getting this question I'm not ready to answer in the
Mm.
backseat of a taxi. I'm totally making eye contact with the taxi driver who's looking at me in the rearview mirror like, "Oh, lady, good luck."
Good luck.
And I'm like, "Why are you asking?" I did. I
You turned the you
TTQA'd.
TTQ'd.
I didn't know learn from my mistake 20 years earlier, and I TTQA'd. And my child was like, just tell me." And then, so then I did. And then my child sobbed and is like, it's not true. And I'm like, okay, I still messed up. I still,
You blew it.
missed, I misjudged the question that was really being asked. I guess that's what it is. Like when a kid asks a tough question, the first job is to make sure you really understand the question that's really being asked,
This is
because what they really wanna know is not often exactly what they'll say, I suppose.
Yeah, yeah, and I think that they're opening a door and that sometimes we have a tendency to, like, bang through it, and
Right.
sometimes we have a tendency to wanna, like, slam it shut and be like, "Never mind that door, you didn't even see that door." So, yes, from the NPR article, the number 1 piece of advice, when you get a tough question, listen for what the child is really asking,
Mhm.
and I think that's what we're saying, right? Like, could something like the ISIS attack on the Taylor Swift concert happened to me when I go to a concert, right? How old is the kid asking? What are they looking to be reassured from their fears? And knowing where they're why is that scaring you? I was a very anxious child. And whenever I heard anything in the news, I was scared of everything. And I was scared of like what at some point, I mean, I must have been like 4 or 5, people were killed during a stampede at a concert, like, something pyrotechnic, something went off, and people were killed in, like, the crush in the crowd. Why this terrified me, I'd never been to a concert, I had no plans to go to a concert, I was 5 years old. But I was so frightened by that idea, and I remember asking my parents about it all the time, like, "How did it happen, and how do you stop that from happening?" And it's like for kids, that locus of control and that growing sense with every year that goes by that like, oh, bad things just randomly happen to people. That might be what they're asking about. So you might want to start exploring like, what is it about that that's making you feel anxious? Because that's not something that's going to affect you.
I was just going to say that some kids are just more likely to be anxious bunnies than others, right? Some are just wired that way. And so the anxious bunny is going to be worried about something they have heard about at a Taylor Swift concert halfway around the world, and other kids that wouldn't even occur to them. I have many nieces and nephews, and I'm thinking of one niece or nephew in particular just now who that would definitely would pick up on that news story and be like ding 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 and need a lot of reassurance. And the other kids I know who are this kid's age just wouldn't even notice that on the news. They just would keep going about their day. Someone
Oh, I was scanning the news. I was like,
yeah.
dunk, dunk, dunk,
Some
dunk,
kids are
dunk,
just
dunk,
like
dunk. I
that.
got to keep
Yeah.
on top of this. What's going
Mhm.
on out there? It's coming to me next.
It sounds a little bit like some adults I know named me, during like, that I have to be on Twitter all
The
the
doom
time, like,
scrolling.
doom scrolling, right? Like,
Yeah.
only if I'm aware of every bad thing that is happening in the world will I make sure I'm ready for the next bad thing that could be happening. It's not a great way
It's not a great way to
go to
go
bed.
through life.
No,
No, no.
no.
Try to skip it if you can.
Yeah.
NPR then suggests give children facts at a pace they can manage.
Okay.
And so this is about knowing this is, Amy, I just feel like we're picking on your faults today, which we rarely do on this
Wow.
podcast. But
I have so few. It's amazing we're hitting them all in this
this
episode.
is this is where you want to rye on the AIDS question. Give children facts, but at a pace they can manage. You did the first part right, but the second part you kind of blew it. You were
Mhm.
way beyond the pace they were ready for.
That's what I think this is the possible error that can be made when let's say, like, okay, well, you have a grandparent who's very ill and you need to explain it to the kids, and maybe you do kind of plan an answer with your parenting partner or on your own, like, okay, this question's coming and this is what we're going to say. And then when it
Yes.
finally comes, you're like doing the like full PowerPoint presentation when the kid asked one simple question. Like, there's a little bit of an over explanation because you want to get all out this thing that you've carefully thought about. But again, maybe it's good you've carefully thought about it, but do part 1A today and then do part 2B next month.
And I think that nowadays, I mean, there's a lot of bad stuff on the internet, but there are a lot of resources. Like you
Mm,
can Google how to talk to my children about a pandemic when COVID starts and find good resources on that subject. Like you don't necessarily want to go into, doom scrolling holes, but I do think there are lots of guides that will help you talk to kids who are worried about war, kids who are worried about climate change or whatever different topics they're bringing to you. It's not a bad idea to look for some guidance on how to talk about that in an age appropriate way because we're not developmental experts. I don't know how to talk to a 3-year-old versus a 7-year-old about climate change. Certainly something they're hearing about it or school shootings. I mean, that is
mhm.
something that, if your kids have not talked to you about school shootings, they're thinking about it. So like
Right,
maybe bring it up. They're thinking
right.
about it.
They
And
talk about it like we talked about fire drills when we
yep.
went to school. It's a part
And
of their life.
so you want them to feel like they can ask questions. This is the next step, which I think is important. It's in quotes. That's a great question. Let's find out more together.
Mm,
I think I want to divide this. That's a great question. I'm glad you asked that question. Thank you for asking that question is a great first response. And then there may be a kind of but. So I'm glad you asked the question about why the lady in the grocery store only has one arm. But next time, we're not going to scream that out because that might hurt that person's feelings.
yes, yes.
But I'm glad you asked the question. People have limb differences. People come in different bodies. And uh I think that we sometimes have an instinct, especially about embarrassing questions. Why does that person have such dark skin? It makes us feel uncomfortable. Like, oh, that sounds like racism. I don't want to do that. That's a good question, but we have to be careful about how we talk about other people. And there can
Yes.
be the lesson in it, but not shutting the door to questions. And I say this as someone who is terrible at this. I was sort of like, no, 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 run away. I don't want to talk about it. I don't know what to say. And as I said, in the times where I have been challenged in this way, I didn't do my best work for
Yeah.
sure.
No, I'm thinking of a moment in particular too that one of my kids called out somebody's appearance. They were burned and just asked the person, like, why does your face look like that? And yeah, I, disappeared into a hole in the ground or wished I could, grabbed my kid, got out of earshot and lit my kid up and didn't answer the question.
Right.
And it's okay to think it. It's not okay to ask the person. It's okay to, save that question. You can talk to me later and now let's look it up. I didn't do any of that. I just was, how dare you say something so rude? And PS didn't answer the kid's question, shut it down, such a question is rude, and did it not in front of the person who was left to deal with that. Like I should have said in front of this person, that's really inappropriate. You don't say things like that. Like that would have been a good thing to do. And then later on say, I was thinking about that question you asked. I understand, blah, blah, blah. Like, I didn't do either of those things. Or
Yeah.
this was like, get me out of this embarrassing situation and yell at my child.
Yeah. Certainly when children are asking questions that embarrass you or hurt other people's feelings, um, it's very hard to do it exactly right. I mean, there's a reason why that's really, really hard. And it's something that's probably worth discussing in advance. Like, hey, as we go through the world, sometimes we see people who
Mm,
have birthmarks, differences, limb differences, injuries, all sorts of different things. Um, I know my children have asked members of our family who are in the military, have you killed people?
mm,
It's not an appropriate question.
right. It's appropriate
Uh,
to wonder, and it's inappropriate to like think about it and like set up a time when you have a question like that. And I was going to say, and it might be a hard question. We can talk about it later, but how does your kid know it might be a hard question? If they're
I,
10, they do.
I think it's fine to just in the moment say, you know what, that's a question that might make somebody uncomfortable. And so it's
Mm,
not really an appropriate question.
mm-hmm.
And then later on, you can say, you can have a whole conversation about it's totally fine to have questions, private questions, or even just silly questions where you're like, the kid's like, did you have sex to make that baby? Like, kids say all sorts of crazy stuff to people.
Uh-huh.
And it's hard. The best thing you could do is underreact and say, you know what? That's not really an appropriate question. And it's a little bit, it's rude. So let's leave that. And then you can have the discussion later. This is why that's rude.
Right.
Because being involved in a war and being involved with situations where you might have been in combat and people were killed, you were involved in killing people, that's a tough question. It's not something you just throw out at someone in the middle of a Tuesday. So the second part of that question was, let's find out more together. And so that's not
Yeah.
really, did you kill someone in the war or why do you have that weird mark on your face? But why are people killing each other in this particular country? Depending on the age, again, like we can figure out more about that. We can research it together because I do think a lot of the questioning is anxiety and knowledge is the antidote to anxiety.
Yes. What I will say again, learn from my many, many mistakes.
We have really botched it on this,
If
guys.
you,
So
if you, if you say that to your child, I don't know the answer to that question, but let's look it up together. Don't open Google and
no,
type in, can people die from heart attacks or whatever? Like, don't.
no.
Not in real time, guys. Not in real time. You can say that's a really good question, and I'm going to find some good answers for that, and we'll talk about that. And then you can find the age appropriate stuff, and the stuff that feels right for you, and share it at some later or not so later time, but definitely not in real time.
No, and I've mentioned before that in these conversations, sometimes it's important to underline that. My kids were maybe like 3, 4, 6, really little, and they were talking about cartoons and like, "Oh, that guy blew up," or almost like a Bugs Bunny kind of thing. And then they were like, "Oh," and they went to Google like people blowing up or something about and I overheard them and I went kind of like we had a computer in the kitchen where we all were for just this reason so that they couldn't Google things unsupervised. But yeah, you want to be careful. This is another great reason to answer their questions, though. Like they can find out information now online, and you want it to
Yes.
come from you and not from Google.
Yes. Good point.
We'll be right back. So, what are kids looking for when they ask questions? I'm going to link to Britt Hawthorne's episode, Her Fresh Take, in which she uses a term that I really like, curious questions. That's a good way to approach questions that are um what's wrong with your face is an inappropriate question and we can have a conversation about why that's an inappropriate question. And we can maybe read a book about facial differences or people come in all sorts of forms. But that is a question that we probably want to redirect, but curious questions, right? Like,
That's why it's important for me to remember like that. It is a curious question. My kid didn't say that to mortify me or even
no,
this other person. It wasn't appropriate. I'm not saying the kid doesn't need to understand it's inappropriate, but it was underneath everything else a curious question. is grandma going to die right when you're already dealing with the height of that yourself? It is a question that will be upsetting to you, but it is a curious question, right? The kid is not like, I'm gonna really throw you for a loop with this one. I'm gonna pull the rug out from underneath you when I ask you this. They are really just wanting to know,
Yeah, and I
usually, almost
think
always.
it's like for me, the metaphor is Dr. Becky, who we've had on the podcast, talks about good inside, right?
Yeah.
Assuming that kids are good inside. And
Yeah.
I think that Britt Hawthorne has this lovely version of like curious inside. And it's like, it may be embarrassing at the moment, it may be painful in the moment, and may, in my case, be more than you can handle in the moment. But kids are curious. And so being able to meet them in that space of curiosity and say, that is a hard question. What happens when we die? And the truth is, we don't know. But our faith tradition says this, or I like to believe this, or many people believe this, and some people believe this, that there are lots of ways to meet children in that curiosity. If you are a person with an extremely strong faith tradition, you might say, we believe this. If you're not a person, or if you're a more agnostic person, you might say, I'm not sure, but I like to think these things. And be in that curious space with your kid, because curiosity is not bad. Curiosity is natural and good.
This is making me think of something I remember my father telling me, and it's crazy that I remember this because I'm sure it just was a minor conversation to him, but to me, it was I was a child, and we talked about what heaven was like. I don't even remember what the context was, but my father told me when I was a child that he thought heaven was like you thought of something and you already had it. Like, you thought to yourself, "I wish I have ice cream," and then there's ice cream in your hand. That's what he thought heaven would be like. And here I am, a long time later, like, well,
Right.
that's what heaven's like. Because my dad told me it's like you ask for ice cream and then it's there. So these we're not wrong that with these conversations feel difficult and weighty, because if you tell your kid heaven is ice cream whenever you want it, they will file that into their hard drive for the rest of their lives. But you can shape it by being supportive and warm and explaining it to them in a way they can understand. I was probably about 6 when my dad said that. All the ice
Yeah.
cream you can eat sounds like a pretty good place to be.
And I think that it's also important to remember that children tend to center themselves in stories.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And so asking about a school shooting is almost certainly asking if they are going to be shot at their school. Asking about uh, and sometimes it's difficult because you think, well, let's take family violence, for example. They hear a story about a mom being killed by a father. You might think, well, they know that my husband and I are not like that. And so, but kids are thinking, would my dad do that to my mom?
Mhm.
And even though you can't picture yourself in that situation, kids are picturing themselves at the center of a story that they're hearing. So 9/11 is what would happen to us if we were on that plane. What would
Mhm.
happen if that was mom's office building and she was in that office building? And it can be very scary for us to put I think as adults, sometimes we distance ourselves. Well, I don't work in an office building. I don't, that would never
I
happen.
choose not to think about such
I
things, right? I look
choose
on the bright
not
side.
to think
Mhm.
about such things.
Mhm.
But that for kids, I think if you continue to push away things that they are scared of, you're not going to end up making them feel better.
Right. You're just gonna give them the message that they're wrong to think about that, that there's something wrong with them having asked in the first place, and they'll
Yeah,
carry that with them instead of the answer.
and also helping them. The number 4 in NPR's list is reassure them that they are safe and loved. Sometimes that is the question. What if a bomb fell on our house? We would hopefully get a warning of it. We would leave together. We would take care of each other. And this is Mr. Rogers' look for the helpers. Like,
Yes.
when you see the tragedy, there's a Mr. Rogers expression I'm sure everybody has heard, that he says to tell children, like, look for the helpers. Like, yes, the
At the
building
scene of,
burned
like, an
down.
accident, like, look for the
Yes.
helpers. If you go by it on the highway, look for the helpers.
And or even in something as terrible as 9/11, it's like, look at all of these people who came together to rescue people and to do things for people. And I think that you depending on the ages and stages, for a 2-year-old, you probably don't wanna be like, if we were in a plane that got hijacked, there's really nothing we could do about it. You wanna sort of say, like, there's a lot of security, there's lots of things to prevent that from happening. I am here to take care of you. As kids get older, I mean, my kids are now teenagers, and we're starting to have a really different range of conversations about choices and consequences of those choices, because I don't want my kids going through the world being like, "I will always take care of you, even if you get in a car with a drunk teenager." Like,
Mhm.
no. If you get in a car with a drunk teenager, there is a very good likelihood you will be killed. Like, I want my kids
Mhm.
to understand that as teenagers.
Mhm.
And so it's very, very important to address this at the correct stage.
Okay. So, can we talk about, like, what the difference is between, say, a three-year-old asking a tough question and how that three-year-old might be answered, and then, like, 10-year-old kinda same question?
Yeah, I think so. What's your question, Amy?
Well, let's do the homeless person because I live
Okay.
in New York City, so this is definitely a question that one asks oneself, every day. It's like, "Why are there homeless people? Is this really the best answer for homeless people to let them make their own decisions about their own care?" And, there's a lot to wonder about. So say if you have a 3 or 4-year-old and they walk by and they say, why is that person asking us for money?"
I think it's simple. I think you would I mean, I think it's not simple. I think you keep it extremely simple. That person is sleeping on the sidewalk because they don't have anywhere to stay.
Mhm.
That person is asking for money because they don't have any money.
Mhm.
Uh, Now, do you give that person money or not give that person money? Now it's a whole separate question. Uh, I choose to give money to organizations that help rather than individual people. Whatever you want to say, I think you just have to answer very simply and very honestly with little kids. And I think in general with 2 or 3 year olds, um, honesty but simplicity under 5 is the way to go.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yes, Mary's grandmother died. Whatever, again, in faith tradition, she's in
Mhm.
heaven now, or
Mhm.
she died and she was in a lot of pain and we're very glad that she's out of pain. Whatever it is that you wanna say, very simple for children under 5.
Mhm.
Another thing that I have talked about before, but I always like to point it out because I experienced it with my own children. Children often play out scenarios that they're trying to figure out or that make them nervous.
Uh-huh.
When you have a parent who dies and then you come upon your children burying each other upstairs and playing funeral, it is, disconcerting to say the least. But this is how kids process stuff
Yeah.
through play. And
Yeah.
so you might after 9/11, there were kids running around and being like, "I'm the plane and I'm gonna hit into you and I'm gonna hijack you and run you." And kids are processing things they are afraid of and things they don't understand through play, which can be disturbing to see as an adult, but it is very developmentally appropriate.
I saw something explaining the best explanation I saw this, like, why would a kid do something like that? That it's just like adults, we make meaning with headlines in The Onion, with memes, with, gallows humor. We're doing the same thing as
Right.
grown-ups. You make meaning by making sense of it in this small, small way. That's just all that kids are doing.
They're
So if
bringing
this
it
helps sort of
closer to
understand that.
themselves. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, yeah, they're bringing it closer and making it smaller at the same time.
5 to 8-year-olds, going back to our homeless question, this is from a Huffington Post article, difficult conversations with kids. This is maybe a little more advanced. That person doesn't have a home to live in. That can happen for many reasons. What are some of the reasons? And you can also invite the kid into, like, what do you think of the reasons? If we're not being clear, this is not happening in front of a homeless person who you
Oh,
are having this
uh-huh,
conversation
right, you're not
about. Like,
interviewing them. Yes, yes.
this is happening as you kind of walk through the world. And this is also different for a kid who lives in New York City and sees this every day than a kid who's visiting from, like, Ohio and is seeing their first ever homeless person and, like,
Right, right.
those
That's
conversations.
that's surprising in a different way.
Yeah.
And then maybe for older kids, um, you talk about get into the question of, like, am I gonna give money to this person or not? I wonder what they'll do with the money if we give it to them. What do you think they'll buy? Does it matter if we know what they're going to buy, right?
Mm.
Is it better to say, "Oh, I'll buy you a bagel," in a coffee instead of giving them the money to go buy a bagel and a coffee? What do you think we should do? And just kind of
Mm.
put it back on them. Um, what are you thinking about this? And find out what they're ruminating on rather than giving them 10 new things to ruminate on.
Yeah, and I think at all ages and stages, if it's a question that is bothering them, like, how can we be part of some small part of the solution? How can we be the helper? And it may be that there is no big solution. I mean, you can't, someone's died and you can't do anything about it and it's a tragedy, but like maybe we could plant a tree in our yard that will help us always remember that person when we see the tree. Maybe we could gather up cans from all of our neighbors and bring them to the food bank for people who are hungry. And I think that just from all points of view, from an anxiety point of view and from a family values point of view, to say, listen, when we see a problem or when we are faced with something difficult, we try to be the helpers. We try to be part of the group of helpers. And, this is something that you hopefully are modeling also for your kids. It's like, when I see something scary, rather than like slamming the door and closing my eyes, I'm running away from it. I try to say, Is there some way I could be part of helping the people affected by this? Or is there some way that I could even just maybe you're ready to go to the memorial service, or
Mhm.
maybe you're ready to go to a candlelight vigil or participate in something that is part of mourning for something that is tragic that happened. And I struggled with this with my young kids, but I really have come to believe that, like, shielding kids, I I can't almost think of an example. You don't wanna go full Amy Wilson, like, "Okay, I'm gonna answer too many questions that you've got." But if a four-year-old says, "What is AIDS?" I heard that term, and saying, "That's not something you don't have to worry about, so don't ask about it." I gently put in your path that that's the wrong choice, that
Mhm.
actually being part of the solution and having gone through an experience in my town and my kids' schools where a tragedy happened, and having talked to a lot of grief counselors for little kids, they universally agreed that you have to give kids the information that they're asking for and ready for,
Mhm.
because they they get more scared the less information they have.
Yeah, that's a good point. And you're talking about maybe we can, donate cans and that will give money to people, like, obviously, it's good to do those things because it's good to do those things, and it's good
Right.
to make the world a little bit better with our actions, but it also, restores a sense of agency to the kid who might have some anxiety about, "What if this happens to me?" That's that's the antidote to anxiety for every one of us, is a little bit more of a sense of agency in a situation. So,
Agency, that's
find the
right.
agency for your kid in that
And
situation.
find the plan too, and around the anxiety. That's right. If it's like, I'm scared of a kidnapper, you have your phone, you do
Uh-huh.
this, you're always in sight of the crossing guard. Like, lean in. Don't say, like, you'd never get kidnapped. Don't worry about it. Well,
Mhm.
let's think it through. Where would that happen? Because I know when
Mhm.
you walk from school, like, you kind of walk through the pieces of it. And the more you stare it down together, I think the better outcome you have. And just ignore my predilection for being like, "No, no, 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 never, 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 we'll never discuss it, and it won't be real." And Amy's predilection for, "Let me tell you all about condoms.
Here here are some printouts I've had ready for this occasion. Get
Here are
ready,
some
kid.
diagrams. Get
Right, right.
ready."
No, don't do that either.
Ah, friends, we solved it, and now we're ready to ask you a tough question. Do you have your tickets for What Fresh Hell Live yet? We
Come
are
on.
coming to a city near you if you live on the East Coast. We're going to be in Charlotte, North Carolina, New York, our hometown, Philadelphia, Washington, D.C., and Boston, Massachusetts, more technically, Somerville. Please go to whatfreshhellpodcast.com today to get your tickets. We can't wait to see you out on the road.
These shows are coming up. It's between September and November 2024. They are coming up. Join
So
us.
get your
Come on, guys. Be so fun.
tickets today. Thanks, friends, and thanks so much for listening.
So long.